Hello and welcome, I'm Lauro Miller and I make videos about programming. Today we'll talk about handling parameters and return values in functions. Return values are relatively straightforward, but parameters they can actually pose a few challenges. So we'll talk about the different cases that can happen and how we can handle them. Let's switch Notion right away and let's get started. Here is a more detailed overview of what we'll cover in this part. We'll start with talking about too many or too few arguments. We then move on to talking about default parameters. We talk about the rest parameter, which enables us to pass an arbitrary number of arguments to a function. We then move on to named parameters and we finish with return values. Let's create a new file here. And I'm going to call this just args.js because I couldn't come up with an easier name. I don't want to make it too long of a name. So let's just call this args.js. I'm going to add up two comments here just to write down what happens. And if I have too many arguments, what JavaScript is going to do, it will simply ignore the extra arguments. Okay, it's not going to throw any error. It's not going to complain. It's not going to do anything apart from just ignoring the extra arguments. If I have too few arguments, then JavaScript is going to set the last x, let's say parameters, to null, or actually to undefined, not to null. So let's say here, okay, let's move on to an example. I think it makes more sense. Let's call this one too many, and this is a function, and we'll declare another one const too few, and this will also be an arrow function. So for this one, I'm gonna have, let's say, 2, 3 maybe, A, B, and C, and then I will just console.log all of them. Console.log A, console.log B, and console.log C. And in the too few, I'm gonna have pretty much the same case, I think. I'm just gonna, actually, maybe we can just have one here, and then we just rename this, and let's call this args, or too many, too few, like so, because we can actually do the same we can explain both concepts to the same function. So let's call the too many, too few with 1 and 2 and 3, 4, like this, right? So here there are too many arguments, and then we'll see that 4 is just forgotten, it's ignored. Now, if I call this function with 1 and 2, for example, then you see that C here is going to be undefined, right? So I'm just gonna, maybe I write the comment here. I'm gonna say C will be undefined. So if I run this code, I should see on the screen 1, 2, 3, 1, 2 undefined. I'm gonna save this. Let's switch to the terminal. And here I'm gonna run with node args.js. And exactly that's what I see. So 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, and undefined. So you see that JavaScript does not really care if you're passing too many arguments, neither if you're passing too few. You know, it's your responsibility to actually be careful that the function is being called with the correct number of arguments, and perhaps there are some cases where you can set some default values. We'll talk about this a little bit later also in this discussion. That's pretty much it for too many or too few arguments. Let's talk about default parameter values. Now remember here, maybe I can create a new file. Let's call this default.js or defaults.js. And I'm gonna copy this function here again to this new file. And I'm gonna say this instead of too many, too few, I'm just gonna call this defaults, right? So default is a reserved keyword. I cannot do that, but defaults is okay. And remember what we just discussed, that if we pass too few parameters, then JavaScript is gonna set the last parameters, the missing ones. So here maybe the last X missing parameters to undefined, right? So JavaScript is going to set the last missing parameters to undefined. It is possible for us to actually set a default value so that JavaScript does not set the whole thing to undefined. How do we do that? Well, it's quite straightforward. We just need to set an equals 0 or whatever default value here. Maybe I can, just for the sake of simplicity, of course, this is not correct. I'm sorry for my IDE is just commenting these things for me or adding this styling and squiggly lines, but here the idea is that we can use the equal sign to actually pass the default value. So in our case, if I pass 0, this is going to be the default value for C. And if I were to call defaults with too few arguments, let's say again, oops, not default, but defaults, with 1 and 2, you will see that in the console, this is going to print 1, 2, and 0. Let's save this, and back here, let's run node defaults.js. And then you see that I have 1, 2, and 0. And these defaults, they can really be anything, right? They can even be a function if I want to. So for example, it could be something like this, but then I need to call the function C, right? If I save this and I run, then I get the 0 again, right? So they can be as complex as you want. They can be functions, they can be objects, they can be primitive values. So you can do pretty much anything you want here. Now, of course, in this case, this wouldn't be the way that we would represent it. I'm just showing you that it's possible to do that. And here you could actually have anything you want. As I said, could be a string. This could be no value provided, for example, and this is also going to work. Now, one comment that I want to make about this is that you really have to respect the order of the parameters. So if I were to set a default value to here b equals 0 and then no default value for c, then this is really not going to work. Okay, see, it will still be undefined, and you may be thinking, okay, if I call then defaults with 2 arguments, then it's gonna see that b has a default value, and then it's gonna take this argument and map to the first parameter, it's going to take the second argument and map to the last parameter, and the one in the middle is going to take the default value. This is not really what's going to happen. If I save this and I just run the whole thing, it will just stick to the order of the parameters, and it's not going to define, it's not going to pass any value to the last parameter. And this is because JavaScript does not have the idea of named parameters. We'll talk about this a little bit later in this part, but more importantly is just it just looks at the order and at the number of arguments. Okay, there is no fancy logic behind passing arguments to the parameters of a function. So just be careful when you are defining the default values. I think that it makes sense to actually start defining default values for all the x last parameters, so that you can ensure that every parameter is going to have a default value. So I would not declare a default value for b here in the middle, because perhaps the only way for you to get it, I don't know if this is gonna work, but let's give it a try, okay? I'm not sure. I think that because we are passing undefined here, b is going to be undefined, and no, it's not going to be. Okay, that's cool. So the only way for you to actually get a default value here in the middle to actually be assigned to the variable is to pass undefined. Let's try to pass null. And once I have null, then this is already assigned to the variable. So the only value here that will trigger the default parameter is the undefined value. So this is one representation, but it's not very often seen. So it happens that it's more often the case that you're not sure how many parameters are going to, or how many arguments are going to be passed to the function. So you will probably define some default values for the last x parameters. But this is no rule, of course, and if you want to do things differently, well, there's nothing stopping you from doing so. I'm just here to also give you a little bit of advice based on the way that I work with the code. I think it's cleaner if you have a systematic approach to default values, and you put all the variables or all the parameters that have default values to the end, right? So you wouldn't have something like this, you would actually have something like this, or if you want to set a default value for b, then you would have a, c, and then b with a default value like so, and then you can pass like this, right? If you pass like this, then everything will still work as expected. Awesome, now that we know how to handle or how to work with default parameters, let's talk about the REST parameter. And this is really a REST parameter. What I mean by REST parameter is the 3 little dots that you can use. Oops, not with this one, but like this. The 3 dots and then some name here, REST, right? But this REST here, it can be anything. It can be REST, it can be other, it can be any name. This is going to be a variable within your function. So let's move on here. Let's clear the whole thing. And here at the ID, let's create a new file, and I'm going to call this rest.js. I'm going to take the defaults here, and I'm going to copy and paste. I'm going to say this, call this rest, right? So the idea here is that the rest parameter, which would be something like this, oops, .. rest, like so. And here I'm going to write it like this. And the idea here is that rest is here for the cases when you have an arbitrary number of arguments and you don't know how many arguments you're going to get in advance, but you still want to make sure that your function is able to handle all the parameters that are passed to it. Let's save this file. Actually, I need to call the function, right? So let's call the function rest with 1. We'll call it with 1 and 2. We'll call it with 1, 2, and 3. And we will call it with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Once I save this, let's here come back to the terminal, and we're going to run node rest.js. And then as you can see here, I have a bunch of interesting stuff going on. So in the first case, here when I call it only with 1, then the parameter A is defined, it receives the value 1. The parameter B is undefined because there is no value for the parameter B. And the rest parameter is just an empty array, as you can see here. If I call it with 1 and 2, then I'm going to have 1 for A, 2 for B, and then still an empty array for the rest parameter. Once I start providing more than the 2 parameters A and B, then all the additional values are actually being grouped in an array that is then assigned to the variable or to a variable with the name rest. As you can see here, I have 3 in the array, and then when I call with more arguments, then I have 3, 4, 5, and 6. If I were to change this to whatever, like this, that's also fine, okay, it's no problem. That the name doesn't really matter. Okay, what matters is these 3 little dots here at the beginning of the name of the variable. So this is a way that you can actually pass more than a fixed, or you can work with functions that have a varying number of parameters. Now, just keep in mind that, well, from my perspective, this is not really a best practice to actually always work with rest parameters and varying number of parameters, because this really, it makes it really hard for you to know in advance, to know at development time, how the function is going to behave depending on the number of parameters that are passed, right? So the idea here is that this may be necessary sometimes. Remember when we talked about tagged templates, we actually had this case where all the interpolations were passed after as a rest parameter to the function, but there are very few cases where you want to intentionally do this in the function. Okay, anyway, it exists, it's a possibility that you can use, and well, it is out there, right? So it's important for you to know that it exists and how it behaves. Awesome, rest parameter is covered. Let's talk about named parameters. And named parameters, as I said, I think I already gave the clue before in this part, they don't exist in JavaScript. So I'm just gonna copy and paste this guy here. And if I were to do something like this, rest, and I'm gonna say, let's say something like B equals 10, A equals 20, like so. I'm gonna save this. Let's see what's gonna happen in my function. So here I'm gonna clear the whole thing and I'm gonna call node named.js. And you will see that this is still the case that A is 10 and B is 20. So here nothing different happened by me saying B equals 10 and A equals to 20. It's still within the rest function. A is 10 and B is 20, right? So there is no such a thing as, so in Python this would work. You have named parameters in Python, but in JavaScript this doesn't work. Now there is one way, of course, for us to implement this in JavaScript, and it is to use an object. So in JavaScript, you can, instead of passing multiple parameters to a function, we can actually pass just one parameter, and this parameter could be something like this. Let's say params, right? And the params here is going to be an object which is going to receive the values that is going to contain the different different properties that we want to access from within the function. So if I were to pass an object with A with a value of 10 and B with a value of 20, then I am sort of simulating how named parameters work, right? Because in objects, we have the keys and then, or we have the properties and then we have the values. And because the properties can be strings, then I can actually use names here to define the name of the properties and then access them by name from within the function. If I save this, let's come back here and run node named.js. I have 10 and 20, very good. And if I were to switch this and say B is going to be 10 and A is going to be 20, if I save this and I run the code, then I successfully invert the order of the values. Now, this is how we could work with named parameters in JavaScript. And this is actually quite a common approach, at least I like it very much. It's very helpful when we're working with TypeScript that we can also directly and statically type the objects that we pass as a parameter, because here really the order doesn't matter, right? If I have A before and B after, that's okay. If I have A after and B before, that's also fine. I don't need to worry about the order of the parameters. And imagine that I have a function just for the sake of intellectual theoretical entertainment. I have some function here, let's say func, which has 5 parameters, A, B, C, D, and E. And here, I would already say this is a bad practice. Never create a function with 5 okay, never is too much, but avoid creating functions with 5 parameters. Just the idea here is that if when I'm calling function, I pass like 1, 2, 4, 3, 5, and so basically I kind of simulating switching the order of two arguments, this is going to impact how the code is actually run. When I'm working with an object, the order here doesn't really impact the code as long as I am not, for example, accessing the values by their actual order by calling object.values or something like this, then the order matters. But in these cases, you wouldn't want to use something you can use object.values. There is an algorithm which ensures the order that this produces the values of an object, but I would still stick to the explicit approach of naming each of the properties that you need to access. But in any case, this is a discussion that goes a little bit beyond here. It's more of a personal opinion, and you will find different opinions online. But in any case, this is one advantage of working with objects. Another thing we can do here is, instead of calling this just params, we can actually use destructuring to access both the keys or the properties A and B directly from the function parameters. We don't need to actually call this params, or we could actually make something like this. This would be one possibility. Const AB is equal to params, like so, and this is destructuring. We're going to talk about this a little bit later, and also when we talk about objects, but this would be one way of extracting the properties A and B directly from params, and I can move this to actually here the function declaration part. This is going to extract A and B directly from the object. This is not going to impact the behavior of the code. If I save this and come back here to the terminal, run this, I get exactly the same behavior. But this is going to allow us something pretty cool, which is to give default values, right? So if I don't pass the key or the property A, then I want it to default to 10. Now let's see what happens, or just for the sake of making something different, let's default this to 5. Once I save this and then I run the code, I actually get 5 and 20. And that's pretty cool, because here, remember that we just discussed in the defaults that the order can be kind of important here. And with objects, because the order doesn't really matter when we are destructuring here, then the default thing, then it can be actually much more flexible. We can also have REST parameters. That's going to be other properties, right? Properties like so. And then I'm going to console.log other properties. The difference is that here, other properties is going to be an object and not an array as before. So if I were to pass B and then something else, let's say something else is 30, and I save this, I run the code, then you will see that we have an object with something else here in the end. This is pretty cool because it also allows us to pass some optional properties here. And if they are provided, we can behave differently. If they're not provided, our function can have another way of executing. Now, once again, I repeat, I wouldn't rely on that too much. For me, being as explicit as possible when declaring and working with functions, it goes really, really a long way in making your program much easier to work with and to expand and to prevent bugs. So, but that's really just a matter of personal advice and personal preference. Now, another thing that can happen here is that, well, what happens if I don't really, so let me get rid of this. And for the rest here, what happens if I don't really pass any parameter, pass 0, don't call it with anything. I'm gonna save this, let's see what happens. And I have a problem, right? So I have a problem because I cannot read the property A of undefined. And that's because the parameter here is really undefined. And although I have a default value 5 for A, I don't have a default value for the entire object. How do I solve that? Well, that's quite easy. I just need to add a default value for my whole object. Once I save this, I then get back my 5 here, and B is undefined because I'm not passing anything and I don't have any default value here. Awesome. So we have covered named parameters and we actually have covered many combinations here. I hope that you feel that there are many possibilities for us to actually have a lot of control over how functions behave in our code. Let's finish by talking about return values. And here in the IDE, I'm going to create a new file and I'm going to call this returnval.js. And return values, really, they can be anything. Again, they can be primitive values, they can be functions, they can be objects. And here I'm just going to call a new function returnval. That's going to be an arrow function. And this function is going to simply return 10, right? And this return value can be then stored for later use. So my var is going to be return val. And once I then console.log my var, then this is going to output 10 in the console. If I'm here and I run node return value, then I get 10. Now, of course, this is a very simplistic example, and I think that the best way for us to discuss return values and how they behave is actually by practical examples as we progress in other series. So for now, it's just important for us to know that we can return something from the function. It can also be another function, so it can be anything. And we can use this possibility to actually implement some pretty cool things. For example, with the decorator design pattern. We were going to explore this in another series, but I just want to give you a little bit of context here. If you're interested in that, you can go and do a little bit more research by yourself and see how this can be used. For example, you would pass a function as a parameter, and then it would do something here, and then it would return the function itself, so that once I call the return value here, once I call the my variable, then you would always execute the logic here, and then you would still have the original behavior of the function. But in any case, this goes a bit beyond the scope of this video. For now, I think it's important for us just to understand the idea that we can output something from the function that can be used later on when we assign this to a variable. That's it for today. I hope I was clear enough, but if there are any doubts, just write them down in the comments below and I'll make sure to answer as soon as possible. In the next video, we will move away from functions and we'll start talking about objects. If you don't want to miss that, you know what you have to do. You have to subscribe to the channel and you will get a notification when the video is out. Quick reminder, let's not forget, in the description of each video there is a link to an online environment with exercises that you can use to practice everything we discuss here. Thank you for your time and I'll see you in the next video. Bye bye.